In the 18th century Igbo land, a young woman was to be wed. But moments before walking down the aisle, she discovered a horrifying truth. Her suitor was not in love. He was a slave trader in disguise. She fled into the night. This is the story of the runaway bride, how one Igbo woman risked everything to escape enslavement, triggering a ripple of resistance in her community and beyond. In this deep dive, we explore the nature of slavery in Igbo land versus the Atlantic slave trade, the social, spiritual, and gender dynamics of Igbo society, the underground networks and safe havens for runaways. What her act meant culturally, historically, and for African memory. Subscribe and ring the bell. Let's uncover the hidden stories they never taught you. She stood by the courtyard moonlight, the soft click of beads on her bridal cap echoing in her ears. The drums had long fallen silent, and under the veil she waited, waiting for the moment when she would step forward to meet her husband. But inside her chest, every beat was a hammer. Something was wrong. The night air was too still. The silence wasn't peace. It was pause, the kind before a storm. She knew this was more than cold feet. Something ancient in her bones screamed run. Her aunt had looked away that evening when tightening the coral beads around her waist. Her mother's smile was forced, lips stretched thin like cloth too taut on a drum. And then the whispers, late at night, behind walls, behind curtains, voices not meant for her to hear, strange men talking in low tones about cargo and departure. Her father had refused to meet her eyes for days. It wasn't until she saw the paper, a strange foreign script with her name written beneath what looked like numbers, that it clicked. She was not being married. She was being traded. The man who had courted her, who had brought palm wine and gifts to her family, was no suitor. He was a slave merchant with polished manners and hidden shackles. He wasn't there to build a home. He was there to steal a soul. Her soul. She had heard of these men, of ships docked far off on the coast, hungry mouths below deck, the moans of people never seen again. And now she was next. Panic set in like a fire in dry grass. Could she scream? Would anyone believe her? She was a daughter, not a warrior, a bride, not a rebel. But in that moment she realized no one was coming to save her. She would have to save herself. With trembling hands, she shed the bridal cloth from her shoulders and wrapped herself in silence. She passed the guards like smoke, feet barely touching the ground, each step erasing a life that was never meant to be hers. She darted past the goat shed, across the shadowed compound, into the forest beyond. The night opened up like a wound. Branches clawed at her skin, thorns caught her wrapper, but she didn't stop. Behind her, voices began to rise. Her name screamed like a curse into the night. Footsteps thundered in pursuit. She knew the paths of her village, but beyond it was bushland, thick and wild. And yet it was freedom. Somewhere between the trees she found herself praying, not just to the gods of her ancestors, but to every spirit that ever watched a woman suffer in silence. "Let me live," she begged. "Let me escape this fate." And as the stars shifted above her, she felt something. Not a voice, not a vision, but a promise. If she survived, this story would not end with her. It would begin with her. She wasn't just running from a wedding. She was fleeing from a world where women were currency, where silence was safety, and where obedience meant death. She was not a bride anymore. She was a rebel, a ghost in the night, a story waiting to be told. She was no longer just a bride. She was a fugitive of fate. To understand the horror that Bride ran from, we must confront a truth many avoid. Slavery existed in Igbo land long before European ships anchored on its shores. But this slavery was not the chattel system of the Americas. It was not built on race. It was built on lineage, debt, punishment, and power. In many cases, those enslaved could rise to prominence, marry freely, even own property. It was complex, layered, and deeply embedded in Igbo cosmology. But there was another layer, one that made this system vulnerable to something darker. As European demand for slaves surged, foreign traders exploited this internal structure, turning what was once social into economic. A man in debt who might have worked off his bondage within a village could now be sold off entirely, permanently, disappeared. A person with a name became a number, and in the cracks between these two worlds, the indigenous and the Atlantic, people like our runaway bride fell. In traditional Igbo society, status was fluid. People enslaved for ritual offenses or family dishonor might be reintegrated through marriage, generosity, or spiritual restitution. But the Atlantic slave trade introduced something unholy, profit without return. It severed the cultural repair systems, and so traders began to disguise themselves as suitors, as friends, as allies. They infiltrate communities not with swords, but with smiles. Our bride's suitor likely knew this. He used the rituals of Igbo marriage, the kola nut, the wine sharing, the dowry, as tools of deception. He mimicked the customs, twisted them to mask the transaction, and perhaps her family, like many others, were trapped too, facing famine, war, colonial chaos. A suitor with foreign goods could look like salvation until the morning after the wedding, when the bride was gone. It's easy to see her as exceptional, but she was part of a pattern of women, men, and children vanishing under the guise of kinship. Her courage pierced that veil. She saw what others could not admit, that their traditions had been weaponized, that their silence was complicity. She wasn't just running from a man. She was fleeing an entire system in collapse. And so Igbo slavery became a paradox, rooted in customs of order, transformed into chaos by commerce. What was once social became structural. What was once temporary became terminal. And from that fracture, stories like this one were born, sharp, defiant, unforgettable. The man had arrived with polished words and smooth yam. His wrappers were fine, his entourage humble yet confident. He brought gifts, not extravagant but symbolic. Wine from the east, coral beads from the delta, a flute carved with a bird in flight. He knew enough of the customs to pass as kin. He knew enough of Igbo hospitality to exploit it, and he knew exactly what he wanted. A bride with no voice, a prize he could profit from. He had visited 3 times before the proposal. Each time he brought stories. He spoke of his farmland near the coast, his wealthy uncle who had no sons, and his trading routes that brought in exotic goods. He never mentioned the ships. He never mentioned the chains. To the family, he was a blessing, a man who could provide, protect, elevate. To the bride, he was a puzzle. Something in his eyes didn't match his smile. The truth surfaced by accident. She overheard 2 of his men laughing near the goats. They spoke in Efik, not knowing she understood. They joked about how this one was easy, how her skin would fetch a good price, how she didn't even suspect. That night she searched his belongings and found documents marked with names, weights, and inked emblems, contracts of sale. She was not the first, and she would not be the last. Her first instinct was to scream. Her second was to stay silent, to gather proof, to plan. She told no one, not even her sister. The shame would destroy her family. If the village knew they had arranged a marriage with a slave trader, their compound would be cursed. So she bore the truth alone, letting her fear ferment into fury. She didn't cry. She calculated. She watched him closely the next day. The way he avoided elder women, how he flinched at ancestral songs. He wore the face of a groom, but not the heart of one. He mimicked joy, but his soul stayed outside the circle. She realized then, this man had studied them like a hunter studies prey, and her family had handed her to him, wrapped in white cloth and innocence. The plot was larger than one wedding. It was a network, a scheme repeated across villages. Traders posed as grooms to gain access. Rituals were turned into negotiations, and girls disappeared, not stolen in the night, but walked out willingly, adorned, singing, never to be seen again. But this bride was not a victim. She had seen behind the mask, and that made her dangerous. The night she escaped, the moon was a blade. It sliced through the trees, lighting her path and exposing every movement. But she didn't stop. She didn't dare. Her feet were bare, her breath short, her wrapper torn. Each step forward felt like a defiance of fate. She was running not just from a wedding, but from a story written for her by others. And she refused to play her part. She had memorized the escape path from childhood stories, through the yam fields, past the abandoned shrine, across the stream near the elder tree. But maps are useless when your pulse drowns out your thoughts. She stumbled through the bush, scratched by branches, bloodied by roots. Behind her the village stirred. First a murmur, then a shout, then the dogs. The stream was the first test. It was deeper than she remembered. The current pulled at her waist, and for a moment, she thought she would drown. Her story ending not with slavery, but silence. But she clawed forward, coughing and spitting, gripping slippery rocks. When she reached the other side, she collapsed, shivering, hidden beneath a curtain of vines. Minutes passed, then hours, then, finally, footsteps, but not of pursuers, of helpers. They found her near dawn, an old woman and her grandson, on their way to a sacred grove. The woman said nothing, just looked into the girl's eyes, and knew. She wrapped her in cloth, fed her roasted yam, and said, "There is a place they do not go. You will rest there," and with that, the runaway bride was reborn. Not as a fugitive, but as a symbol. The journey continued for days, through dense forest, past ancient altars, into lands ruled by silence. She avoided roads, choosing instead the paths where footprints fade quickly. Each night she changed her name. Each morning she shed more of the girl who once waited to be married. What remained was something harder, sharper, a woman who had seen the edge of betrayal and lived. They say she crossed 3 rivers, walked barefoot for over 50 miles. She hid in women's compounds, under baskets, inside shrines. Each time someone asked her name, she told a different story, but the one thing she never lied about was who she was running from, and soon her story spread, whispered from one woman to another, and with it, something dangerous was born. Hope. Because when one woman runs, it's survival. But when many run, it becomes rebellion. Long before the Atlantic winds carried ships of steel and chains, Igbo land had its own roads, paths known not for trade, but for escape. These were routes carved by memory, protected by silence, and lit by the footsteps of those who refused to be broken. And though the slave traders had maps, they didn't have access to these networks, because these paths didn't belong to kingdoms. They belonged to the people. One of the most remarkable sanctuaries was the Nuri Kingdom, a theocratic state that rejected the slave trade outright. Within its borders, those fleeing bondage were not just hidden, they were honored. To capture or sell a slave within Nuri territory was not only illegal, it was considered a spiritual abomination, and so the kingdom became what some called the land of freedom. The runaway bride may have never made it that far, but the dream of it guided her steps. Other safe havens emerged, too, clusters of villages that formed Osu-free zones, spaces where the untouchables and the enslaved found solidarity in their shared rejection. These were not just geographical zones, they were moral barricades. They represented a refusal to comply, to trade, to forget. And over time, they became critical points in the resistance web. Women especially became central to these networks. Market queens, shrine keepers, elder matriarchs, they knew how to move unseen. They understood silence. They sent messages with song, herbs, and cloth patterns. One knot in a wrapper could mean danger. A sprig of bitter leaf could signal refuge. The bride wasn't alone. She was part of a larger, quieter war. One fought not with spears, but with shadows. These networks operated like rivers beneath the earth. They moved people from danger to safety, from slavery to freedom. They did not ask names. They did not require payment. Only one thing mattered, that the person running had chosen to live, not to surrender. Historians often focus on battles, kings, and treaties, but the most effective resistance often goes unrecorded. It happens in kitchens, in whispers, in footsteps through the bush. It is not loud, it is enduring. And that is how the bride survived, not just through her own will, but through a network of unnamed heroes who believed that no woman should ever be owned. She did not walk alone, and because of that, she walked free. Her story, like so many others, was never written down. There were no official records, no ink-stamped documents, no names carved into monuments. But it lived, and in hushed lullabies, in proverbs whispered by firelight, in the knowing glance of elder women, when brides dressed in silence. In Igbo land, history isn't always written, it's remembered. Oral tradition became the vault that preserved her defiance, not as a grand epic, but as fragments, scattered pieces carried across generations. One village tells of a bride who vanished before sunrise. Another sings of a woman who crossed 3 rivers and was never caught. The names change, the details shift, but the core remains. A woman refused to be sold, and in doing so, saved more than herself. Colonial records, unsurprisingly, are silent on her. They were never meant to record resistance, only ownership, profit, loss. To them, she was an anomaly, a disruption, perhaps even an inconvenience. But to her people, she became a caution, a warning, and a legend all at once. Elders invoked her story when a marriage felt wrong. Girls heard it when they asked too many questions. It became less about the facts and more about the feeling, the resistance. But as the world modernized, these stories began to fade. Western education, religion, and colonial pressure labeled them myths, stripping them of their political weight. The bride was turned into folklore, her bravery reduced to metaphor. Yet even then, the story clung to life. Because truth, when rooted in community, doesn't vanish, it adapts. In recent years, scholars and activists have begun to trace these silenced tales. Oral historians, griots, and feminist anthropologists have unearthed variations of her journey, not to canonize her, but to recognize the patterns, the coded language, the shared trauma, the bravery in anonymity. Her story wasn't isolated. It was echoed across regions, across decades, in the footsteps of countless women whose names we'll never know. She may not have had a last name, but she had legacy, and that legacy whispered through time, refusing to be silenced, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that survive without permission. In the patriarchal gaze of colonial accounts, African women were passive, property to be traded, moved, or erased. But in truth, Igbo society, while complex and hierarchical, carved out real spaces for female power. The runaway bride's defiance wasn't just personal, it was cultural. She didn't simply say no to a man. She challenged an entire economic system, a corrupted ritual, a betrayal wrapped in tradition. Igbo women were never silent figures. They held markets. They led revolts. They sat in councils of Umuada, powerful assemblies of married daughters who could shame, protest, and even curse men into change. In her act of escape, the bride tapped into this lineage of feminine resistance. Her refusal to be commodified echoed a deeper truth, that womanhood, in Igbo culture, was never meant to be voiceless. Yet her resistance also reveals the fracture, how colonization and the Atlantic slave trade distorted gender roles. As the pressures of external economies grew, women became increasingly targeted. Their value shifted from community role to global commodity. Marriage, once a spiritual and social union, became transactional, and in that distortion, violence found cover. But her escape reminded the community, and all who heard, that womanhood was not weakness. It was power misread. Her body was not a vessel for trade, but a weapon of interruption. By fleeing, she forced her village to question what they had normalized. Was tradition sacred if it cost someone's freedom? Was silence virtuous if it protected betrayal? Her story, then, is not just about survival. It's about gendered agency, about a woman who chose life, autonomy, and legacy over obedience. She became a symbol, not of a victim escaping doom, but of a force rewriting fate. And in doing so, she reopened a door long closed, the right of women to choose, not just their husbands, but their futures. Her body may have been targeted, but her spirit redefined the boundaries of womanhood in a society on the brink of transformation. She wasn't just a runaway bride, she was a reclaimer of womanhood. Centuries have passed since she vanished into the night, her feet carving rebellion into the soil of Igbo land. And yet her story ripples still, not just in folklore or memory, but in the very fabric of modern Nigeria. Because the systems she defied did not vanish, they evolved. They dressed themselves in new language, new policies, new silences, but they remain. In parts of Igbo society today, descendants of enslaved people, known as Osu or Ohu, still face discrimination. Though slavery has long been outlawed, its social residue lingers like smoke in the air. Families deny marriage based on bloodline. Children inherit stigma. Communities pretend not to see. And in this new struggle, the runaway bride's story becomes a mirror, reflecting not just a historical act of courage, but an ongoing demand for justice. Her choice to run wasn't just escape, it was disruption. A reminder that systems built on silence and profit must always be questioned, no matter how sacred they appear. She was a woman, alone, outnumbered, with no army behind her, and yet her single act of defiance outlived empires. That is legacy. That is power. Modern activists in Nigeria are now challenging caste discrimination, campaigning to end the ostracization of OSU descendants. Their protests echo the same refusal she once embodied. I am not property, I am not curse, I am human. And as they speak, they unknowingly chant the same anthem she lived. Perhaps her name was lost to time, but her story is inscribed in every girl who chooses freedom over fear, in every woman who walks away from violence, even when no one claps, in every community brave enough to confront the past, rather than bury it. She is not gone, she is multiplied. So if you've listened this far, remember, history is not a relic, it's a responsibility. The runaway bride left more than footprints. She left a question we must all answer. What would you do if your freedom meant breaking everything you were taught to honor? Because sometimes running isn't cowardice. Sometimes it's revolution.